Welcome to the Mad in America podcast, your source for science, psychiatry, and social justice.
Hello, and welcome to the Mad in America podcast. This is Justin Carter. I'm a doctoral student in psychology and the editor of the research news section at the Mad in America website. We provide daily reports of the latest research and debates in psychology and psychiatry and conduct interviews with leading figures in the field. Today, I am fortunate to be doing such an interview with Kirk Schneider. Kirk Schneider is currently running for president of the American Psychological Association, or the APA. He is a licensed psychologist and an adjunct faculty at Saybrook University and Teachers College, Columbia. He is well known as the leading spokesperson for integrative, existential, and humanistic approaches to psychology, which emphasize the therapeutic relationship and the importance of confronting the deep paradoxes of being human and the conflicts that arise from them in psychotherapy. He's authored or co-authored 12 books, including the Wiley World Handbook of Existential Therapy, The Spirituality of Awe, Challenges to the Robotic Revolution, The Polarized Mind, Why It's Killing Us and What We Can Do About It, and most recently, The Depolarizing of America, a guidebook for social healing. Many trainees in counseling and clinical psychology will recognize Schneider from the APA Psychotherapy Training videos featuring his therapy work. Schneider is campaigning to serve as president of APA to, quote, address the existential crises that are now flaring all about us. He puts it this way, quote, we are in crisis racially, politically, and environmentally. We are in crisis with gender and sexual injustices. We are in crisis with mental and physical health. In short, America is poised on the precipice, and if our profession fails to grasp this problem, we are, in fact, in danger of inflaming it. In this interview, Schneider discusses his path into psychology, including his own struggles and growth, his approach to psychotherapy, his scholarship on the psychology of awe and the polarized mind, and then we turn our attention to his vision for psychology in the future, a whole person approach to healthcare, a, quote, Psychologist General of the United States, and the development of dialogue groups that can help address the polarization and division we see in our political discourse. Welcome to the Mad in America podcast, Kirk. It's great to have you here.
Thanks very much, Justin. I appreciate being here.
To start, I wonder if we can go to the beginning. James Baldwin once said, history is not the past, it is the present. We carry our history with us, and we are our history. I imagine this is as true for personal history as it is for our collective social and political histories. You've written before about the loss of your brother early in life and how that affected you and even altered your life trajectory. How did these early experiences bring you into the world of psychology?
It's a great question, and I guess I think of my history almost like a patchwork quilt that has many weaves to it. Certainly the loss of my brother when I was about 2.5 years old and he was 7 was a huge blow, a shattering to me and my family, my parents in particular. It was like a rip in the fabric of our day-to-day lives and our routines, our familiarity with ourselves and the world. I was in quite bad shape as a young kid because of that. I have very unique parents, and that probably should be noted. Actually, my mother just passed away. She was 90 years old, and I've grown to really appreciate what an inspiration she is personally and also professionally. She was a leader, a pioneer, really, for women. She had a great deal of pluck, and she fought her way into becoming a leading spokesperson for radio and television in Cleveland in the late 50s and early 60s. And she always had a very expansive spirit. She believed if you can do something, do it. Go for it. And she definitely brought that fire to me and those she touched. But she went through a very profound struggle and torment after my brother died. And as a result, she went into psychoanalysis. She had the wherewithal to do that, which was quite, I would say, unusual for that time. Again, we're talking 60-some years ago. She actually referred me to a child analyst who was extremely important as I look back in helping me to just find a footing in life. Because this was somebody outside my family system who was very seasoned. I don't remember a word that was exchanged, but I do remember his presence. I think he was a middle-aged guy. I was very young, of course, probably 5 at the time. And he just brought a very steady, calming, seasoned presence, like a sense that he had really been there in profound ways in his own life. That was, the kind of intuitions I had even as a little kid. And that was extremely important because my mother and dad were having quite a challenge for a period of time. My father was also a very unusual guy. He was a school teacher and became a principal. His main field was science and education, and he eventually became a professor of education. And he did his dissertation on creativity in kids. And so I spent quite a bit of time with my dad, making up stories, talking into a tape recorder that he had. When I was as young as 4 years old, I'd be talking about the government and pollution, and also stories that I saw in movies or books that I read. So he was very encouraging of that. They were both very supportive of me dealing with my emotional life to the degree possible. As I said, I was in some trouble for a period of time. I would go on long periods of crying and of screaming and raging, and had a lot of fears, night terrors. And I think they did all they could, to really help. And I'm so grateful for that. My dad, unfortunately, died very young. He was 53, and he died of a massive heart attack. I grew up in a very unique circumstance and neighborhood. We were the only Jewish family in a basically Italian, German, Catholic neighborhood. And at that time, in the early 60s, it was still pretty challenging for Jews in that kind of circumstance. I remember one time where we woke up to see a big black Nazi sign painted on our ping pong table, which was hanging in our garage. There was a neighborhood bully, who would call me names and dirty Jew, whatever. Beat me up a few times. I actually have no regrets at all about having grown up in that environment. I think it's been very important as a thread in my life of discovering, the beauty, the charm, the knowledge of others.
I'm interested in hearing about this because a lot of your work, especially recently, focuses on the impacts of racism and marginalization and even oppression. And often, being a white man in this country, it can be easy to kind of remain in a state of obliviousness or even denial concerning these issues. And it sounds like you had the experience of being the oppressed, but then also the oppressor at times. occupying both of those identities at an early age. Can you talk a little bit about how your eyes were open to that?
Very much so, Justin. Unfortunately, that was a part of my experience growing up too. I, like many kids, wanted to identify with the crowd, with my peers, and there were times, like this one time that particularly stands out for me, where a gang of kids, a group of kids in the neighborhood, in the street, started chasing after a kid of color. And he was also, I think, limited mentally and emotionally. And so which just added to the prejudices of kids. I mean, we were 7 years old, maybe. And I followed him. And it obviously stood out because that wasn't typical of me. I just got caught up. This incident I remember because my father saw it from the house. He abruptly ran up to me, took me by the collar, took me back to the front of the house and spanked me. And it was maybe one of 2 times that he spanked me on the butt, so I remembered it, but he didn't. It wasn't just corporal punishment. He sat me down and he talked to me, and the first things that he conveyed were the seriousness. Do you understand the seriousness of what you're doing, Kirk? I mean, what if those guys were chasing you and you were this fellow, Joe, running away and terrified, and they were chasing you because of your skin color? How would you feel? What comes up in your mind about that? And I don't remember the details of the conversation, but I know we had a long talk about it, and it impressed me profoundly. And that was a part of a kind of a general upbringing that was conscious, I would say, or concerned about social issues, about social justice issues.
So there you are as a young person, and you've lost your older brother at a very young age. And it's clear that, life isn't guaranteed for anyone forever.
Right. That's right.
And you're trying to make sense of your role and position in your community and I guess in the world. And it sounds like your parents set an example for you. They also connected you to the world of psychology and then also the world of, literature and film that helped you find your place. But not every child is as fortunate to have those kind of outlets. And I'm wondering, how it might be different for, a child going through some of those same experiences that you had today.
I'm sure radically different. I mean, my parents were first generation from Ukraine, East Europe, but somehow they found that, these sort of psychologically, psychosocially enriching paths for themselves. And I'd say I've been extremely blessed in having that. I mean, I would say there are a few, wealthy families that have that kind of background generally and not be raising questions with their kids. I mean, I see this as a huge problem in our educational system generally. I think the gutting of the arts and humanities has been an extraordinary mistake in our system, and I think we're paying for it dearly all across the board in the country in terms of sensitivity to each other and ourselves. But that's a whole other issue. That is one reason why I very strongly want to do what I can to support people in all kinds of situations in our country who experience a great deal of emotional impoverishment as well as economic. It's obviously particularly difficult to to be a recipient of emotional deepening and contact when one is just striving to get bread on the table, or work to scrape a living together. So this is one reason why I feel so strongly about a Psychologist General. Yeah. We'll talk about later, being somebody who helps to represent psychology in a larger way, yeah, with a larger influence, and in particular on helping people gain access to quality mental health care. And I'm talking about, longer-term intensive, emotionally corrective relationships that people will have access to and that are so deprived of in so many settings in our country.
After having these early experiences, you found your way into the field of psychology and then into a sort of humanistic, existential sort of subfield in particular, and studied with the famous existentialist Rollo May. So I'm interested to hear a little bit, how did you find your way there, and what was that experience like?
Well, again, that's a part of my very unique upbringing. My dad was immersed in articles and books by Abraham Maslow, Carl Rogers in particular, Rollo May, all humanistically oriented. I mean, I would play with some of these books in my playroom. They were part of the buildings that I would create, So I came to them very organically, and again, through conversations with my dad. But so it was a kind of a natural evolution in my growing up, fascination with the human condition. Clearly, a lot of that, to me, is clear, comes out of this very early tear in my life experience that just took me into other worlds very young and exposed me to these radical terrors and unknowns of living and dying. Fortunately, again, I had the support that could help me tap into those new worlds in a way that eventually, after a long time, got me to a place of being able to be intrigued with them, at wonder about them, and not just paralyzed. And I was paralyzed for a good part of those growing up years.
It strikes me that having confronted some of those, like you said, terrors or even tears in sort of the fabric of reality in some way,
yes,
it's not inevitable that you would seek out a field of existential therapy where those questions are ones that you have to continue to read about and face on a daily basis. And what was that like to kind of have to intellectually meet those tears over and over again?
I like to say that, I was introduced to existentialism at 2.5. Basically, that's the reality. What was it like? Well, I lived in a scary, scary world. I was afraid of dying. I was afraid of germs. I was quite hypochondriacal, afraid of sort of demonic influences. I had fears of my parents as well at times. A kid has, all kinds of fantasies around a profound death like that, and almost no perspective and no layers of experience to kind of contextualize something like that. So, of course, your mind goes all over the place. So these are a lot of the things that I needed to work through. I was alone, which had its great sides in terms of being able to develop more of an inner life, creative life, imaginative life, because I did make up a lot of stories, and I loved science fiction, as you know. And I thought that some of the programs in those days were fantastic, at least for a kid like me. I related to a lot of those strange worlds, that were shown on shows like One Step Beyond about the paranormal and Outer Limits, the early Twilight Zone. I'm still very intrigued by those because they open us up again, to the radical mystery of being. And that's really the path that I see that I've been on, for 64 years. And one can be both obviously horrified by it and overwhelmed, which I experienced at significant points in my life, but also just fascinated with it and seeing it as, as awesome, as distinct from just horrifying and overwhelming. And that's a great place to be if one can find what I would call a ground within groundlessness and deal with the paradoxes of that. So those shows actually helped in a lot of ways because I was getting other support to be able to deal with it. I was sure scared of them too. But my trajectory was more and more, again, toward the arts and humanities. I loved English literature. I loved drama, sociology classes as I got to high school. And then in college, I guess I blossomed with psychology. I really blossomed in graduate school. I had the good fortune of going to some great places with people who were disciples of Maslow and some just direct forebears of humanistic psychology.
Can you say a little bit about what humanistic psychology was at the time? I think it was sort of emerging and it was seen as sort of countercultural and it was changing psychology in significant ways. What was the sort of culture of humanistic psychology at that time?
I think that the most substantive aspect of it was an attempt to try to understand the whole human being to the degree that's possible, our whole-bodied experience of life. And the feeling was among a number of the founders that psychology had become reduced into part processes, whether that was more external and behavioral or just focused more on intellective changes, conditioning changes, or physiology, medical. The sense was that we weren't really getting to the agentic capacity to discover one's core values and aspirations in living. What life was about in a fuller sense, what really mattered to each individual. And so this whole field blossomed from that, and it was connected with revolutionary movements in the culture in America in the 60s that were on parallel paths, trying to break out of the straitjackets of the Victorian era of the 50s. And it was a very dynamic time. Now, out of that also came excesses, which I think are very problematic and unfortunate, but understandable. I think, for example, I have the greatest admiration for R.D. Laing and his work. I think it's just pivotal in our field, and especially in terms of understanding, opening to alternative ways of seeing reality and so-called psychosis, and really blowing the lid off of our so-called normal functioning in society, really moving to a much more socio-political, cosmological context for understanding human behavior and experience. But I feel he made some mistakes, you could say, personal mistakes that had something to do with his own struggles that compromised the really important messages that he and others were attempting to convey to psychiatry and psychology. And some of that, I think, was encouraged by excesses in the 60s. That was partly about experimentalism and partly about perspective again. Yeah. Not knowing what would happen if people took an excess of drugs or experimented in very freewheeling ways. with intimacy, etc.
Right.
Rollo May wrote a very perceptive book about this, Love and Will, where he was calling people to acknowledge the beauty and the wonder and the absolute richness of the opening up that was going on in the 60s and early 70s, but also to note some caution about it, to have more of a meta perspective on, and maybe more of a kind of carefulness about the fragility and vulnerability of our humanity as well.
Yeah, it seems sometimes humanistic psychology is characterized in terms of just focusing on the positive elements of human behavior, what might be possible, how we might change. And then existential is focused on sort of these deeper, darker confrontations with the harder parts of, and the harder to answer parts of being human. And it seems your work, especially on awe, integrates sort of both sides of this. Can you talk a little bit about how you came to integrate those and what awe, how you developed this idea of awe?
Yeah, well, I feel integration has been a thread through much of my life, and I've come around to it through hard experiences of my own and experiences of excess. I did have some of those experiences in my graduate years at, for example, the State University of West Georgia, which was basically one of the first concentrations of humanistic psychology on the East Coast, and was created at Maslow's blessing. I had wonderful professors there, wonderful community, but I also struggled some with the radical openness of it. I actually had some of the most important psychotherapy, existential analysis there in my life, and that was just a pivotal follow-up to that earlier analysis I had as a kid. But some of my earlier issues were sort of getting activated at that time, and that was extremely important and has really kind of made me a crusader for a more holistic depth approach to therapy. So I've been aware of deep fragility and humiliation, if you will, a sense of smallness in my life, as well as a great capacity to venture out and to take risks, and to see that those can often be extremely rewarding in one's life. But they need to be tempered with a humility about, again, how vulnerable and powerful, you could say, subconscious forces of the psyche can be. The notion of being a fragile creature before the vastness of existence. So at least for me, that dynamic or dialectic between smallness and greatness has been extremely important, and I find embraces a vital sense of life, a kind of a holistic sense of life, to be able to be present as possible to one's deepest dreads and sadnesses, poignancies of life, as well as one's most dazzling desires and possibilities. What more can one get out of life? I mean, to me, this is the gift that we've been handed, and both are extremely important to each other, really. As May put it, they fructify each other. Without one, you don't have the other in its depth and intensity, and its possibility for discovery. So again, I feel I've been very fortunate to have been led and to have led myself along that road. So the sense of awe has been an organic notion that it came out of a lot of personal experiences and professional experiences, and seeing people getting stuck either in their smallness or in over-identified with greatness or expansiveness. And what I've found is that almost invariably these extremes, or these what I call polarizations, the fixation on a single point of view to the utter exclusion of competing points of view, pertain to trauma that people have had. And they're doing almost everything they can to avoid any hint of the opposite in their lives. And so it makes perfect sense then to design a life around hyperarousal and let's say grandiosity or narcissism if one feels terribly small and imperceptible and not counting in life. And I definitely see a lot of that problem in our current culture, and especially among certain leaders. And I'm not just talking about one area. I'm talking about our profession, professionals, as well as, business, social, political, religious realms. But also people could go the other way, where they're just terrified of taking any chance outside the box because of their particular traumatic matrix. And so they hunker down and keep themselves small and avoid any hint of a more expansive way of living.
It strikes me that that this conception of awe is a little bit different than other ways of thinking about helping people in psychotherapy, right? It's not about mitigating or like taking up some middle position between feeling small and feeling large, but rather it's about sort of having that being able to experience both of those things simultaneously, being able to bring your experience of smallness into your experience of your potential, being able to bring your experience of your potential into your experience of feeling small.
Well, to the degree one can, and this is my integrative perspective, is that I realize we all live on a spectrum, really, a spectrum of capacities, and not everybody is either ready for or desirous of that sort of fuller range of contact with these diverse experiences within and without oneself. And I think we need to respect that. I do think that there's a lot of people, a lot more people than we realize, that do yearn for a much fuller and richer range of living, and who are trapped in much more restrictive forms of living, in part because of the systems that emphasize a more quick fix, instant result sort of model of living. The sense of awe brings, I believe, a kind of a spiritual or psychospiritual dimension that we don't often think about with psychotherapy, that I believe organically can evolve from a therapy that is available to a deeper level of exploration of one's concerns, which can then open to one's possibilities, fuller possibilities for living. And in a lot of ways, I see that kind of therapy, I'd call it an existential integrative therapy, as a kind of staging ground for cultivating a sense of awe, because you're moving continually between just crushing humiliation and smallness and fragility to, gradual, incremental venturing out, whether that's with your therapist, expressing a feeling toward that therapist, anger or sadness, allowing a more feelingful life, allowing it with others in your sphere. Maybe it's in regard to a project. And then, of course, there are the almost invariable times where people become unable to maintain that venturing out, and so then they get squeezed back in, and or it could go the other way, where people attempting to restrain themselves more in discipline and focus, but just can't hold it. And so they end up going back into the original traumatic-based position. So in many ways, this kind of therapy I'm talking about, at its best, is a movement between a sense of abject terror and paralysis to incremental intrigue and even fascination with the possibilities of a larger life, the more of who one can be. And it's that back and forth movement between terror and wonder that can eventually, hopefully, lead somebody to find that ground, that foothold within the groundlessness that we all are living in, really. That's the larger context of life and existence, as far as we know it.
I was going to say, you've contrasted this conception of awe with what you called the robotic revolution. And you spoke a little bit about the way systems kind of encourage us to polarize, or even how collective traumas or individual traumas can encourage us to polarize. So, what is the robotic revolution, and how is that limiting our ability to live with this sense of awe?
A lot of my recent concerns have been with the increasing technicization or technocracy of society and of individual living, our increasing reliance on the machine model for living, if you will, the digital mediator of our experience between self and world. And what is the cost of that? It's clear that all of us are becoming more and more reliant on our smartphones, our internet, our computers. And now with the pandemic, there's even more of a press to rely on our, Zoom meetings, et cetera, our virtual realities. And by no means am I a Luddite. I don't paint this as all bleak. But I do have a lot of questions and unsettlements about it that I feel are shared by many people who really think about these things, of what all this portends for our society. In Spirituality of Awe, challenges to the robotic revolution, I define a concept I call roboticism, which is the gradual attempt to emulate the machine model of living, and actually ultimately the gradual prospect that we don't just emulate that model, but that we become that model. So an actual melding with machine world. And this is not an idle fantasy. This doesn't come out of nowhere, but people like Ray Kurzweil and others who have affiliated with something called the transhumanist movement, which is as they see it, the expansion of consciousness based on robotics and genetic engineering and nanotechnology, et cetera, appear to believe that it's not only useful to us to use our technology maximally, but that it's actually a very positive thing. And they talk about moving toward the singularity, which is the point at which you can no longer distinguish the human being from the mechanical. And of course, we've seen this type of scenario in a lot of science fiction. I mean, I know that's extreme, and it's not the reality of where we are now, but there's certainly hints of that. I guess my sense is we really need to be careful. We need to be vigilant about how much computerization takes over our world.
It's interesting. In sci-fi, sometimes we worry that the singularity will be accomplished by creating robots who have human consciousness. But it sounds like you're saying there's also a worry of the opposite, is that we achieve the mind meld with technology, not by technology becoming like us, but by us becoming like technology.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's some logic to that. I mean, at some point, our machines are going to be so, quote, great and efficient that it's very possible that it will no longer be functional to have the kinds of vulnerabilities and peccadillos that we have as humans, flesh and blood problems that we have. And certainly the idea of lasting, indefinitely is appealing to a lot of people. I mean, this is part of that whole lineage of the search for the Holy Grail and immortality, and some of the themes that people like Ernest Becker warned about, striving for an immortality project writ large. And it's extremely seductive. So I do want to bring that up. It's extremely seductive, and I understand as a human being, we all get sucked into the idea of living a more efficient life, more convenient life, much longer life. And I'm a believer in that too. If we could supplement our flesh and blood way of living with the mechanical, that helps us live longer and richer, especially a more enriching kind of life, great. But here we get back to the problem of what's driving this. Mm-hmm. And if it's fear, like, as I was saying before, is the driver of so much extremism and polarization, then we're in real trouble. And I don't think we've examined the collective fears that this movement has come out of enough. And I think people like Michel Foucault have done profound analyses of this, with his focus on this major turn toward industrialization soon after the Dark Ages, so-called. And the attempt on the part of at least Western civilization to do everything it could to move away from any hint of our primal relationship with nature. And so it was very good and important in so many ways. It got us great intellectual developments, got us, into our heads much more, brought rationality to the fore, which is obviously helpful in so many ways in terms of lifting our standard of living and the way we treat each other and avoiding illnesses. But the big question he raises is, did we throw the baby out with the bathwater? In this headlong striving toward a kind of a hyper-sanitized, controlled world, what's the price?
Yep, I just was going to say, as Foucault did, we can turn and look at this critique and how it applies to our field of psychology and psychiatry, right? And so as you were talking about the seductiveness of sort of creating models of human behavior that are more predictable than humans are, certainly we see that playing out, I think, in psychotherapy research, and we're looking to create sort of manualized short-term models, delivered as a drug would be almost, and just looking at whether or not we're decreasing, symptoms as they've been defined, in sort of a very medical way. So I'm wondering, how does this whole person approach, how does this integrative approach to seeing the fullness of, human vulnerability, how do we integrate that with studying psychotherapy and making sure people have the best services available to them when they go into mental health treatment?
A huge question. And it relates back to this socioeconomic context that many of us are living under. So if the socioeconomics of our world presses toward instant results, appearance and packaging, getting things done in a sort of a mechanistically efficient way, then that's going to impact every other part of our lives, major part of our lives. And certainly science and psychology are not exempt. And this is where I have a lot of empathy for the position that psychology is in. To a large extent, it's driven by these larger socioeconomic contexts. The pressure by funding agencies, corporations, etc., to maintain this model what I think we can bring with a more holistic, integrative perspective is to recognize that this is part of our world, and that it's helpful at some levels. I believe people sometimes benefit greatly from medication. Let's say to get through the night, to get through the week, to get through very rough patches in their lives. Or they benefit from other kinds of physiological support, from cognitive behavioral support. There are people in life circumstances where they don't have the luxury to take more time to look more deeply at their whole bodily experience of life, and the question of how are they presently living and how are they willing to live. I mean, these are two very fundamental existential questions at the deepest levels of treatment. So, yes, helping somebody to think more rationally, or to behave in a way that is more functional in the world, or to be supported by external inputs to help them stabilize in life, can be extremely important. However, there are many people who are being severely cheated by this model and shortchanged, and it's a tragedy. It's a tragedy right through our entire system, from training therapists to the way it's practiced, in my view. And I think we can, as a field, as a profession of psychology, we can bring a larger perspective to this problem, especially if we develop the backbone, the courage to stand for the full offerings, or the fuller offerings of our field. We have many brilliant people in our field, from these more, you might say, in a sense, practical, programmatic types of treatment that tend to be focused in on through the medical-like research methodologies that tend to uphold these forms of approaches, right through to therapists who are much more psychospiritually concerned, who are concerned more with the diversity and multicultural perspectives of the clients, patients that they see, who don't necessarily fit into these standardized, some would say colonized models, and who are concerned with depth, a depth perspective in psychology, psychodynamicists, existential humanists, etc. And they have a lot to bring to the table too. And I would argue that they really can bring the pendulum back toward a more fruitful dialectic in our field, and bring our field more to a holistic perspective. But what we need to do more of, I believe, is to use the bully pulpit to stand for our fuller science and our fuller ranges of outcome research. We're missing a lot of that outcome research. A lot of that outcome research is done by extremely reputable researchers, such as John Norcross and Bruce Wampold, Lambert, etc., who find over and over again that these more holistic relational contexts are pivotal to effective psychotherapy and to what clients say about what's pivotal for them. And even that great Consumer Report study that Seligman did, some 10 years ago, which surveyed clients, did a lot of qualitative research about what consumers most appreciated about psychotherapy. And it was these more intensive, longer-term relational kinds of approaches that were more enduring and more central to them feeling of vitality about their life. So I believe we can contribute to the whole culture by having a greater influence from our full range of offerings within our field.
Yeah, so sometimes the critique is made of psychotherapy, right? That you can do the best work with somebody in an hour a week or a couple hours a week. And if they keep going back into a society that's trending towards greater inequality, discrimination, marginalization, that it might help them through that, but we're not addressing the sort of the larger problems that are driving people to have some of the experiences that are incredibly difficult that we see in therapy. And you've made this decision to run for president of APA to address some of these larger issues. So I wonder if you could speak about your decision to run and how much of that is caught up in trying to get psychology to address some of these larger systemic cultural issues that are affecting our patients.
Well, it's all about that. It's all about bringing a voice to psychology, to the national scene that represents, again, a more integrative, holistic perspective. And so one of the proposals is around a call for a Psychologist General. I can't go into detail right now about that, but I've written about that in Scientific American. And I'm continuing to develop the concept as I'm in discussions with people at council and the board level about it. But basically, someone to be a point person who works in coordination with APA advocacy and our APA resources to be a bigger a megaphone for advocating for so many of the areas where we're underserved in the population. We have tremendous mental health crises, as many know, from depression to anxiety to addictions, horrifying forms of hate crimes, racism, suicidality, and in many cases, despair about living in our current world. So there's a great need to bring these resources to bear. And I do think that having a representative from inside government to focus really strictly on psychosocial aspects of mental health care is vital. And really, it seems our time has come. I mean, we've had the medical domination of that arena within government. Why shouldn't it be paired, with mind as well? A more concerted focus on mind and body. They go together and they can integrate and be coordinated. But I think we need authorities that are just as powerful in the psychosocial area as well as in the medical. And then I believe very strongly in healing dialogues. And I think we can bring these to bear within our own field. And I've called for, if I am elected, the assemblage of leaders or presidents of all our divisions to come together to talk about what they can offer, what each specialty can offer to the crises of our times. And we collate that data, we bring it together, and we communicate that to the larger public. And perhaps out of that comes more research and projects that are engaged, by funding agencies, et cetera. I also believe in healing dialogues in terms of the various factions that we have within APA. So bring leaders from scientific wing and the practice wing, qualitative research, quantitative research, depth psychology, cognitive behavioral psychology, ethnic and cultural perspectives on psychology, and more standardized perspectives on psychology. Bring all these various factions together to learn about and understand each other as much as possible. And out of that, what we've seen from these healing dialogues that I've been involved with nationally, is that when the focus is on attempting to understand and learn about the other, it tends to enhance the likelihood of achieving common ground and of building bridges. And it's so different than the kind of verbal flame throwing that so easily devolves from our usual way of conversing in this culture, and especially these days, through media and through political circles, the echo chambers that people get caught in. It's like, what's the alternative? The alternative is we continue the verbal flame throwing, which is like pouring more gasoline on an already raging flame. A second alternative is to devolve into violence and war. And a third alternative is to devolve into helplessness and despair and total stuckness. So I ask people who are very questioning of a dialogue approach, what are the viable alternatives? I mean, certainly I believe that one viable alternative is to make your voice heard, to engage one's righteous indignation, one's righteous anger about the status quo. I think that's extremely powerful, and we've seen through many movements in history, civil rights being a more recent one, that can be a very powerful impetus for then promoting the, let's say, national conversation and having practical impact on the powers that be. But I do believe ultimately that is a springboard or an impetus, and that ultimately we need to come to the table and talk to each other. So it's not just about intellectual exchange of views, at least the way I view these dialogues. I call them the experiential democracy dialogue, which comes out of my work, both developing that one-on-one dialogue format and Braver Angels, a national organization that brings groups of liberals and conservatives together for living room style dialogues. But for me, it's more than just about, learning about and understanding each other on more of a kind of intellectual level. It's about supporting the people to be more present to themselves and the other at even nonverbal levels. That's the next step, really, for much of our democratic process, and a vital step, really, to addressing the kind of social breaking that we're experiencing right now, racially, politically. It's got to be more than just heady. We need supportive, that is safe as possible, structured dialogues that adhere to ground rules. Otherwise, it so quickly devolves into these flare-ups that I was talking about before.
I'm hearing the potential for the dialogues in two ways. One, you're talking about the work with Braver Angels, sort of psychologists working to create dialogue groups in the country so that people can come together and start to find common ground to face some of these challenges, racial justice, climate change, political crises that are facing us, and then also a role for healing dialogues within psychology, as you're talking about it.
That's right.
So that psychologists can come together and speak with an integrated voice, a mosaic of voices, as you've said, about some of the policy level initiatives that could help heal some of these crises, the mental health crises, the suicide crises, the addiction crises. So I'm wondering, how would an integrated voice of psychology, maybe in a position of Psychologist General, what kinds of policies do you think could be advocated for that would help to address some of the rising rates of suicide, anxiety, depression, addiction, et cetera?
Well, first of all, through these bridge-building dialogues, we become a much more potent force. And we can concentrate our priorities, I believe, in a much more powerful way at the national level. So what might we bring? Well, one thing that immediately comes to mind is advocacy for making longer-term, in-depth, relational, emotionally corrective, therapeutic context available to a much larger range of people. Where I know we have thousands of dedicated, extremely astute professionals working at that level. But I think many of them are handcuffed because of the socioeconomic restraints that they're under, and the kind of again efficiency orientation that they're under, which is shortchanging to a lot of people. So we could certainly advocate at the level of priorities and federal funding, and we could point out that we do have studies. APA came out with a review of these studies that show a lot of medical offsets to people getting quality mental health care, even at the levels that they're being presented now. But just imagine how much could be offset, how many expenditures could be offset, maybe not only in medicine, but at the level of attrition in work or lowering recidivism to prison, supporting people to find more new leases on life or more motivations for living, which could certainly have serious impact on economic growth, even to perhaps the level of the military, of maybe not needing so much emphasis on militaristic elements in our society. The question again back to priorities. Do we fund for what we know and what our science tells us about what's most flourishing for a society and an individual in the longer run, or do we just keep patching up these holes that are cracking in the walls of our society, and they're going to blow through? It's pretty clear.
To bring it full circle here at the end, I'm just struck by how this kind of advocacy that you're speaking about might make, how that might affect an individual child, maybe experiencing a great deal of anxiety for a variety of reasons, having lost somebody close to them or not having sufficient supports. And how might, this kind of advocacy at a federal level allow more children to have the sort of corrective experience with mental health care that you had as a child?
Exactly. I want to see children have the kind of experience and support that I had as a kid, because I know I would have gone off the rails if I didn't have that support. And I was headed that way at points, especially in my early elementary school years. I feel extremely strongly about that. I want to see others have that availability, and it can happen. We are a productive and forward-thinking, innovative enough society to do so much for ourselves if we but allow ourselves to think outside the box more, and face these kinds of issues.
Thank you so much for joining us here at Mad in America. It's really a pleasure to have you, and we wish you the best of luck in your campaign for the presidency of the American Psychological Association. Before we wrap up, is there anything that we didn't get to touch on today that you thought would be important to mention?
I appreciate you asking that, because I was thinking as I was describing the experiential democracy dialogue and Braver Angels format, that didn't have time to go into detail, but much of this is laid out in my recent book, The Depolarizing of America, a Guidebook for Social Healing. So if people are interested in going into more detail, it is available there. Also, people might be interested in my website, which is kirkjschneider.com. So there's a lot more about all of these themes that are accessible there. And I just want to say I found this to be a very profound and gratifying engagement with you.
Thank you.
And inquiry. So
Likewise.
Thank you for your important work.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to the Mad in America podcast. Visit madinamerica.com for more news, views, and updates.